Um, just give me a second. I think it's some settings issue.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Now the screen is visible. Sir, but you are not audible, sir. Are you on mute? Sir, still you're not audible, sir. No, sir. Not audible.
Okay. Is it audible now?
Yes, sir. It is audible.
It is. Okay. Okay. So hopefully now it is audible and you can see my screen.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining the call on a Saturday morning. So I'll quickly jump on to the topic of today's talk, and what we are going to discuss is about open source software licensing. Yeah. So if you see this screen, I think there are some icons which you can certainly relate to. If not everything, I think I'm pretty sure with the Mozilla or with DC++ or the Penguin from Linux. And those of you who might have done coding before or maybe from a computer science background might relate to others as well. So all these things that you see here is basically open source software, or you can also call in certain cases free software. So once we go to the slides, we will try to distinguish between the free software and open source software. But for all practical purposes, both are more or less, the terms are used together, and we generally call FOSS licensing, free or open source licensing. Yeah. Now, one thing which I would like to clarify before we really proceed with the topic is open source software as such is quite a huge topic. I mean, you might have a lot of things associated with it. Primarily, like for example, how people come together and develop such software, how community development models work. From a legal perspective, it often is a question which surprises most people that making making something open has created so much rather than really keeping it very close, protected. Yes, there might be many such things. What open source means for business, what is the economics of open source, why people contribute to open source, why people create open source, and so on. But we are not really going into the details of all such things. Rather, what we do is we try to focus on the licensing aspects of the open source software. Yeah, so that is the idea. And now this, most of you might already be aware of different forms of intellectual property rights that can be associated with software. Like for example, you might have logos, icons, or sometimes user interface or a trade dress, which is your trademark protection. On the other side, you have design protection. In certain cases, the UI of software can be protected as a design. In certain jurisdictions, it might not be possible. But two prominent forms of intellectual property which are always associated with software is copyright and the patents. And in this rest of this presentation, we are basically going to focus on these two aspects, the patents on software and the copyright. So I think the fundamentals of patents and copyrights you might already be aware. Copyright protects the artistic creation, it protects the original expression, but not the underlying ideas itself. Yeah, the quantum of originality or the intellect that you have to have there is very, very minimal. In patent, however, getting a patent is slightly more difficult. Your invention should be new, non-obvious, and it should have some industrial applicability. So now, as I said, we are going to focus more on the aspects of copyright and patents, which are associated with software. So as you see, the copyright protects source code or the code of software as literary work. The copyright protection still is there if you convert the source code into binary form or in any other form that software is usually converted to. So the copyright will have protection over the source code. And as you know, with Berne Convention and the international initiatives, you now have copyright. Once you have created something which is protectable in your country, you might have it protected across the globe. As we speak, I think there are 180 or 180 plus countries which are signatories to Berne Convention, and because of this, you have copyright protection in all these countries. Yeah, so with copyright, you get certain rights like right to reproduce, right to distribute, or rather you can call this as a negative right to prevent others from doing all these without your permission. Yeah, so what you can prevent others from doing is basically to reproduce your work or distribute your work further or make adaptations of it or make public performance of it and so on. Similarly, in patent, if you see the software patents itself as a topic of debate, we have been discussing it since decades altogether now. But nevertheless, we'll keep things simple for purpose of our discussion now. And the way I put it is that we are not really trying to protect software. We are trying to protect the technical effect or the technical context that the software generates. Yeah. So if you look at the image here, you'll see a car using a sensor to detect something which is probably in front of it, maybe applying automatically the brakes. So this is the technical context that software generates, and we are not really getting into the debate of whether software code can be protected as patent or software itself can be protected as patent. And you will realize in most practical applications, you will always be able to find some technical context. Yeah, so with patents, of course, you have to apply patents in individual jurisdictions. You have PCT route and so on. But nevertheless, by default, you'll not have patent granted everywhere at a time. With patents, you get right to use, manufacture, sell, import, and all such things. So now, with reference to copyright and patents, when you have a patent over the technical context that the software generates or the code of software which is copyright protected, will have certain rights. Now what happens is usually these rights are granted to others by way of a license. Yeah, so if you see an example here, you have this license which talks about subject to the terms and conditions of this license. Licensor hereby grants you a worldwide non-exclusive license to reproduce, prepare derivative work, and so on. So basically, this is the first part is a copyright license where you are giving somebody or the licensor certain rights to that he can exercise certain rights. He can reproduce your work, he can prepare derivative works, and so on. Rest of the rights might be granted, might not be granted. In a similar way, you see a license which grants certain rights over the patents. Yeah. So if you see terms and conditions of this license, and then you again have worldwide non-exclusive license to make, have made, use, offer to sell, import, and so on. So fundamentally, by using these licenses, the copyright owner or the patentees can grant certain license to others so that they can exercise these rights which are otherwise reserved for the copyright holders and the patentees. Yeah. So now when you talk about these licenses, basically the license can be subject to certain conditions that you have to fulfill certain conditions to really exercise these rights. And if you fail to adhere to those conditions or fail to fulfill certain obligations, then your rights might be terminated. Now, till now we have understood that software has some sort of IP protection. Primarily, the source code is protected by the copyright law. You have the functionality or the technical effect that it generates is protected by the patent law. And for purpose of this discussion, we are not considering other aspects of intellectual property law. Now, these rights, being the owner of these rights or holder of these rights, you have a possibility to give it to others using licenses. Yeah, these licenses can be subject to conditions or certain obligations. Now, what we do is we basically come down to the topic of today's discussion. And the first thing I would mention here is something called free software. Yeah, so I'm not sure if you have you are already aware of something called Free Software Foundation. And in early 1990s, Free Software Foundation was the organization in the leadership of somebody called Richard Stallman. They started this idea of free software. So their thinking was that once you restrict access to the source code, there might be that might not be the best way to deal. And any license which is associated with the software should provide these four fundamental freedoms. So the first freedom is that one should have liberty to run the program as they wish for any purpose without any restriction. So it should not be that you use it for non-military purposes only. Then you see the freedom to study how program works and change it so that you can customize it based on your requirements. So this was the second freedom, which a license should grant the licenses to be called free software. Yeah. Finally, you have the freedom to redistribute copies so that you can help others, and then the freedom to distribute your modified versions to others. So if you see the freedom number 1, and the freedoms are numbered from 0, 1, 2, 3 because that is the common way that you use in software. So they decided to do it this way. Yeah, so freedom 0, freedom 1, and then particularly for freedom 1 and freedom 4, you need access to the source code. If you do not have source code, you probably cannot study how program works. You cannot really modify, customize it for your own needs. And also for the last one, you might not be able to do certain things if you, rather you cannot even modify the software if you do not have source code to it. So source code, availability of source code under a license is a prerequisite so that these four freedoms are granted by the license. Now, any software license which has these four liberties given to the licensor is something which qualifies as free software license. And the software provided under free software license is called free software. Yeah. And again, the Free Software Foundation has been pretty vocal to make it very clear that we are talking about freedom as in free speech and not free as in free beer. Yeah, so we're not talking about the free as in money, but it is more of freedom that is associated with free speech and so on. So I think this makes it clear. The other way of looking at is something called open source software. So after free software, you have basically another organization called Open Source Initiative, and they adapted this definition of what is open source software. I'm sorry for the typo, it still says free software, but it is basically, the slide is about open source software. Yeah, so if you are aware of a project called Debian Linux, so Debian community has certain requirements that anyone who is contributing to the Debian community should license their code under a license which has these 10 things associated with it. And after that, Open Source Initiative adapted these 10 things to say that any license which has these 10 things will qualify as open source license. For all practical purposes, there'll be a huge overlap between what is free software and what is open source software. There might be few cases here and there where a license may not qualify to be a free software license but qualifies to be an open source license. But those cases are going to be very, very few. Yeah, so beyond this, if you now see, it again requires more or less similar things. Like, for example, people should have right to freely distribute. You should have access to the source code. You should be able to modify and create derivative work. Author should be able to dictate terms as in, integrity of his source code. Like, for example, if you are making modifications, then author might require you to give the original source code separately or point to the original source code separately. The license should not discriminate against people or groups. Like, for example, it should not have sort of export restrictions for that matter. It should not discriminate against field of endeavor. Like, for example, again, as I said, the license cannot say that you cannot use it for military application, you cannot use it for some specific application. Similarly, it should allow you to distribute license along with the code. It should not be tied to a product or a particular line of products. License must not restrict other software. Like, for example, in a CD-ROM, if you want to distribute 10 different software, so this license should not really say that other software should also be of similar nature or open source. Otherwise, you cannot distribute. So something like that should not be there. And it should be technology neutral. So if a license does not restrict anything, which is listed here, and provide all these possibilities, then this license qualifies to the open source license. Yeah, so fundamentally, when you are granting a license to software, and if your license qualifies to be a free software license or open source license, then the software licensed under it is termed as FOSS, either free software or open source software. Okay, so do we have any questions so far?
No, sir, no questions in the chat.
Okay. Yeah, now what we do is we go to the next part where we categorize these licenses, these free software or open source licenses. I mean, it will be referred as OSS rather than every time clarifying the free and open source. So if you look at these licenses, they are basically categorized into 3 different categories. The first category is called permissive licenses. The second one is called weak copyleft, and the final one is called copyleft licenses. So if you look at this category of permissive licenses, what basically these licenses do is they have very minimal obligations when you are distributing the code under it. Yeah. So once you receive open source software under one particular license, it will have certain obligations or certain conditions associated with it. And these obligations are usually triggered when you are distributing the code. Yeah, so if you download free software or open source software and use it internally for your own purposes, there are no obligations really. Yeah, but when you distribute it or you offer it as a service in certain cases, then certain obligations trigger. So in the first case, if you see the license example is BST, And when you integrate this BSD code in your product, you can just license everything under your choice, under your own choice. Yeah. So if the picture in center is basically the license of for your own product, then this BSD code can also be licensed under the license of your own product. However, it might have certain obligations, like for example, it may say that in your product documentation, you just mention the copyright holder's name. You just mention that this is under BSD license and so on. So those sort of obligations might still be there, but primarily you can license the permissive license code under terms of your own choice. Yeah. In second category, if you see, it is weak copyleft. Like for example, the example here is MPL, which is Mozilla public license. This is the license that governs your Mozilla browser that you have. In such licenses, what they do is the original code, which is under Mozilla, or modifications of that code have to be licensed under the same terms and conditions. So they have to be licensed still under Mozilla public license, but your code can remain under your own choice as long as the license conditions are followed. Yeah. So taking in again, going back to Mozilla, what it says is that if you are modifying a file or copying code which is under Mozilla into a new file, then that particular file always should remain under Mozilla and rest of the stuff can remain your own. Yeah. So in such a case, if you have your proprietary program or a program licensed under any other license, it can remain under its own terms and conditions as long as the Mozilla part remains under Mozilla. The third category is the strong copyleft licenses, and this strong copyleft license says whenever you merge it with some other code, then everything together should be licensed under its own terms and conditions. So that is where the term copyleft also originates. So what we do, this GPL license, when you say, it is basically a license which came through Free Software Foundation when they started this free software movement. And then they decided that all these 4 freedoms should be given by a license. That was the time when General Public License version 2 was written by them. And they use copyright law to put an obligation on someone modifying that code so that when he is distributing to his downstream recipients, then it has to remain under the same license. Yeah. So if I download some GPL code and make modifications to you and pass it on to one of you, I have to give it under GPL license. So that is where the term copyleft originates. So you use copyright law to ensure that someone gives away his code or his ownership code under the same terms and conditions. So these kind of licenses in certain cases might be critical, because if you incorporate it in your product, then entire thing has to be licensed under the general public license or a license whichever is applicable. So these category of licenses are called strong copyleft license. Okay, so let us take an example of a permissive license. Now, if you see Apache software license is a permissive license. What you can do is you can just go and search Google for these names and you will be able to find the entire license text. And I would encourage that if you have a look at one of these license text, then you might be able to get a fair idea. So for purpose of our discussion, I have just copied some part of that license. And what the some part of license says is that if you are redistributing the code under Apache, then you have to provide a copy of license. You have to provide notice of modification if you have made modifications. You should not remove any notices from source code if you are passing on the source code. And finally, there's a notice text file which is generally present in Apache distribution. If you are creating derivative work of Apache and distributing it, then this notice text file should be distributed. So this notice text file might contain the name of copyright holders and the details of who all have contributed to such a license. Yeah. So this, if you see, when you take code under Apache license and you want to distribute it further, then the obligations are pretty simple. You give license text. If you are modifying, just make notes that you are modifying the code. Do not remove any notices. And in certain cases, you might have to redistribute the notice text file, which is present in the distribution. So you do not have to really bother about it. You can take this code, integrate it with your own product, or in whichever way you want to utilize it, and you can pass it on. So such licenses, what they do is they can be easily used with commercial software. They are easy to meet the obligations. and it enables you faster adoption of technology. Because, like for example, if you want more and more people to use the open source that you are releasing into market, whatever may be the strategic objective there, but once you release code under Apache or BSD or MIT or any other permissive license, it becomes easier for people to use because there are not too many obligations, and complying with such licenses is not that difficult. Yeah, so if you go to Apache Foundation website, you'll find a lot of software is released under Apache license. Uh, I don't know if something comes to your mind when you say Log4j. There was security vulnerability in the library, which was basically Apache Log4j, which was found end of last year. So might be able to relate with it. Yeah, and then you move on to the next category. Then you have copyleft licenses. So if you read this particular clause from General Public License version 2, it says you must cause any work that you distribute or publish in whole or in part contains or is derived from the program. Program is something which is licensed under GPL v2. So whenever you distribute something which in whole or part contains the program or any part of the program, it should be licensed to everybody at no charge under the terms of this license. So what it means is the moment you take the GPL code and try to integrate it with your own software or any other software, then GPL requires you to provide the entire thing under the terms of GPL license. Now, there are certain exceptions. I'm not really going to go into the details of it. Like, for example, Linux kernel is something where the Linux Foundation has clarified that the kernel space code, while user space programs interact with kernel space code, it does not create copyleft on it. And thus, they can be released under their own license. So there might be certain exceptions. There might be certain use cases where you are able to use this. But in principle, what I'm trying to highlight is if the code is under such a license, then it might require the modifications or derivative work or the combination of it with other programs might have to be licensed under the terms of same license. So Linux kernel is one example, which is for GPL v2. I think the DC++ is also an open source software which is under GPL v2. Now, licensing software under this might provide limited possibilities to use in commercial software. The compliance might be slightly burdensome because even a small part of logic, small part of code which is copied from under such a license, if it comes to your proprietary program, then it might not be a good idea to use. But at the same time, you can always ensure that the code or the software that you have released under GPL2 remains under GPL2 because when people modify it and pass it on, they have to ensure that the license remains same. Yeah, so this is an example of a copyleft license. And finally, again, if you see the Mozilla public license, this is what I was telling you previously, that if you see the word modification is defined as any file in source form that results from an addition to, deletion from, or modification of the contents of the covered software, and any new file in source code form that contains any covered software. So all these things will be covered by Mozilla public license, but rest of the code which does not really, any file in your code base which does not borrow code from under Mozilla public license can remain on its own. So these kind of licenses are also very popular, and they generally provide you more possibilities for plugin architecture, let's say, for example. So what you do is you make the base platform open source under one of such license, be it Mozilla, be it Eclipse public license, be it common development and distribution license, and so on. And what you can do is this remains under its own license, and when you have plugin which can interact with it, can remain under a proprietary or a commercial license. So sometimes you will also find a lot of business models wherein the base platform is released under open source and the premium plugins are sold separately that can work with it. So this kind of license works very well in that case. And beyond that, it can be used with commercial software. Of course, you have to observe what it allows, what it don't, so that you do not get into a copyleft situation. And come relatively burdensome as compared to the permissive licenses, but it is slightly better when you compare it with something which is strong copyleft. Yeah, so this is another category of open source licenses. Yeah, so once you go and if you get time, you can just go through the Mozilla Public License version 2.0 and you'll get to know what that license tries to achieve. Initially, you might also omit the technicalities. I think these licenses are pretty simple. It's a legal document which tells you your rights and obligation when you use or download software under this license. Yeah. Okay, so now there is one more thing that we might have to understand, and which is called license conflicts. Yeah, so what happens is when we are particularly doing, so till this point, what we have understood is what is open source, what are the requirements for a license to become open source or free software license, what are the broad categories. Each of these categories may have different licenses. They might have different approaches to various aspects of the license, but nevertheless, they are categorized into this broad category. Now, what we are talking about is using these licenses into our product. Yeah. So while you see these explanations of permissive, weak copyleft or copyleft licenses, it can be seen from both perspectives. One is while you are using, what implications it can have, and when you want to make something open source, then what exactly you are trying to achieve depends on it. So if you want more and more people to use, and if you release it under a strong copyleft license, then that might result in a deterrent. People might think that it will have copyleft on our code, and they might not be motivated to use it. So these cases we have to understand from both perspectives, whether you are using the software or you are creating your own open source software project, or you are contributing to an open source project. Okay. Now, when it comes to a product, particularly in a commercial organization case, you will have these open source going into our products. Yeah. So if you look at a product scenario here, a lot of licenses are incorporated in one single product, and this might result in license incompatibility or license conflicts. Yeah. So what license conflict is, fundamentally because when you try to adhere to the requirements of one license, you end up violating the other. Yeah. Or you cannot really comply with both licenses at the same time. So one such example is here. This is another open source license called GNU Lesser General Public License version 2.1. And if you see in the clause 6 of this license, what it says is that you have to permit reverse engineering for debugging such modifications. And now on the left side, if you see, the code is under LGPL 2.1, and what it says is that you have to permit reverse engineering of the the program for making modifications to GPL program and then debugging such modifications. And the other component in your software you are using is commercially procured, and it does not give you right to reverse engineer beyond required by the law. So in such a case, what's happening is the incoming rights are less, and what you are now supposed to give as an outbound right is going to be more, because you have to permit reverse engineering, and the commercial code that you are using in your product does not allow reverse engineering. So this is the case where there's a mismatch between the incoming rights and the outgoing rights, or it can be a mismatch between incoming restrictions or incoming conditions and the outbound conditions. So this scenario we call relicensing or vertical conflict, and this is an example of it. So maybe once you, if you get time and if you just go through this Lesser General Public License 2.1, I think it's going to be quite an interesting read as a software license, and you will be able to figure out what all it requires and how technical it might get in certain cases. Yeah. Okay. So beyond that now, as we already discussed about the complexity that comes with copyleft licenses. So here what's happening is, let's say, for example, you have Apache software license and Mozilla public license in your product. And what you are trying to do now is to integrate a GPL component. So now GPL component requires everything to be licensed under GPL. And whereas Mozilla public license will say no, Mozilla code has to be under Mozilla. So if you remember what we discussed about Mozilla Public License previously, that any file that contains code under Mozilla, whether original file which is modified or a new file wherein Mozilla code is copied, shall remain under Mozilla Public License, and rest of the software is fine. But unfortunately, GPL requires everything to be under GPL, and it might be an issue in this case. However, just for information, this particular problem is solved by Mozilla Public License 2.0, I think, or 2.1, by allowing relicensing of Mozilla code under GPL. But if that clause is not existing there, then there might be a conflict between these two licenses. Yeah. And again, if you start reading GPL2, there's a clause in GPL2 which says that you cannot put further restrictions on what user can do with the code. So when you combine this, Apache is a permissive license, and we might think here that Apache software can be licensed under GPL because it does not really require any copyleft, or it does not have any copyleft provision. But what happens is GPL v2 basically says that you cannot put any further restrictions or additional restrictions on what user can do with the code, and certain clauses of Apache related to patents and so on are considered by Free Software Foundation as further restrictions. So here again, there's a mismatch, and because GPL is trying to extend the copyleft over the entire program, other licenses might not be compatible with it. Yeah. So in this case, we call it horizontal conflict, or it is basically a conflict usually introduced by the copyleft. So when these open source licenses go into a product, then we should understand whether the licenses are compatible with each other or not. Okay, so any questions so far?
So there's a question in the chat.
Okay.
Purushothaman is asking how you perceive API in licensing.
How you perceive API in licensing?
Yes, sir. How does API function? License apply to API?
So there can be two basically possibilities. One thing is when you talk about the REST APIs or web APIs, in that case, the software which you are offering through these APIs is basically residing in your server, and you're offering it as a software as a service. So in such a situation, you have to figure out, are you using some license or some open source license which has an obligation when it is offered as a service. So one such example is a Affero general public license, which has an obligation when it is offered as a service. I think it's only, the obligation results only when you're modifying it. In the other cases, you might have APIs when you are distributing the code. And while you're distributing the code, the license obligation applies as you are distributing something. Now, the question arises is, one is the Oracle Google question, whether the APIs to what extent are copyright protected. But that's, I think, a separate question to be discussed, whether there's a copyright over it or not. Yeah. The second thing is, while you use something using the APIs, is it really creating a derivative work, or is it really creating a combined work, and whether copyleft extends to such a use or not. That is something which essentially depends on what license requires. Yeah. So in case of a REST API, if you are interacting with a GPL application, then the copyleft might not extend in most cases, but we have to again look at it if you are really creating a natural extension of the program, the combined stuff. In certain other cases, it might be slightly more closer interaction between components using APIs, and then it might have derivative work. Yeah. So does that answer that question, or it was something more specific?
Thank you, sir.
Hello, sir. This is Samrat here. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Sir, I have two questions, sir. One is that pertaining to this open source software, we know that the domain of open source software is basically the copyright. but there is also a possibility that कभी-कभी patents में भी इसकी utilization होती है sir. तो आप can kindly tell whether if it is being used in patent, does it have any limitations per se for actually not getting that registration smoothly? I mean, getting the patent smoothly. And my second question is that in case if a suitable candidate does become a patent, sir, I mean OSS becomes a patent. In that case, how do you subsume the risk analysis and also the IP evaluation in that case, sir? These are the two questions. इसके ऊपर अगर आप प्रकाश डालेंगे तो बहुत अच्छा रहेगा.
Okay, so Samrat, can we do one thing? I'll just go through next two slides and then I'll come back to your question.
Great, wonderful.
Is that okay? Okay, cool. So now what we do is basically we come to the question of patents and open source software. Of course, something which you make open source publicly disclosed, you will have difficulty then filing a patent. That is quite obvious. But at the same time, making something open source does not mean that you cannot have patents over it. In terms of risk analysis, look, there are two possibilities. One is basically the loss of possibility to file a patent. So once you make something open source, till that point you have to just protect whatever patents you want to file and whatever ideas you generate. So once you make a public disclosure, it might become a problem. So you should file patents before it. But at the same time, I would like to emphasize on the point that patents does not mean that you cannot make something open source, or open source does not mean you cannot make something, you cannot really file patents on it. Yeah. Now, the way I see it is like, for example, if you see this particular example, what's happening is you are basically licensing certain code under Apache license, which everyone can really download and use. And if you see the clause written below, I mean, I do not want you to really read that, but what that clause talks about is that once you're providing this under Apache, you are also granting rights to the patents which cover, such software which is licensed. So so open source licenses, usually you will find the open source licenses which are quite elaborate. They have patent clauses in it. And this problem is there since very beginning, because if you look at GPL v2, you will realize that beyond preamble of the license, it does not have any explicit patent grant. And that became quite a contentious issue, particularly when Microsoft was not happy about these open source software. And they were quite aggressive with their patent portfolio, saying, okay, no, we are going to have patents on that and so on. So after that, GPL3 came, and if you find GPL3, it clarifies the situation of patents in there. Similarly, this license Apache also has a quite elaborate patent grant clause. So it not only talks about granting patent rights over what you're distributing under Apache, but it also talks about when you create extension to it, changes to it, then in which case you are really going to grant patent rights. Yeah, so that is one part. Now, to come back to the question, maybe some part of that question, if we intend to make something open source, it does not automatically mean that you should not file patents on it, because patents might give you a lot of advantages with respect to it. Like, for example, if you have patents, you might still be able to block a competitor from creating something else which is equivalent to the open source project that you are trying to create. Patents can also be used for defense. If you do not file patents on it and somebody else has a lot of patents, while it is open source and you are trying to use it in your product, those patents might always become a threat for you. So if you have patents, you can always utilize it for cross-licensing. And of course, people who take code from you under Apache license will automatically get a grant of patent rights as well. So they are not really bothered or not really threatened about it. Yeah, but having patents on the technology, of course, is helpful. Again, I would just say that I'm not really getting into the question of now novelty. So patent has to be filed before something is made public. If I have an open source software, then you cannot really protect the functionality of it in most cases when you are filing a patent after that, because you will lack novelty. So I'm not really getting into the novelty part of it. It is assumed that you file patents on time and you have your portfolio before you make something open source, or your competitor has portfolio before something is made open source. So, now if you have patents, it really brings a lot of advantage. One. The second aspect of it, if you see the same Apache license, and what I'm doing is I'm contributing under Apache license. Some code I take and contribute to the open source community, which is using the Apache license. And if you try to see this clause below, so it basically says in the previous one, you will realize that subject to the terms and conditions, each contributor hereby grants you a perpetual worldwide. Yeah. And if you see, you can be a individual or a legal entity exercising permission under this license. And when you try to read the definition of legal entity here, you will again realize it is quite broad, which talks about particularly for a bigger organization or a group of companies or a multinational organization, it basically covers the entire group of companies, not just the entity that is contributing to it. So if you see this particular case, you have 2 patents and you are contributing some code to Apache. Now there might be some patents which might be held by some of your group companies, and the clause is broad enough to really cover everything there. So this sometimes might result in making something open source and unintentionally granting the patent license, which otherwise you would not have granted. So now in terms of risk assessment and valuation, the point is, as an organization, if you are talking about you are only going to make something open source when it serves some purpose. Like for example, a lot of cases you will find that the fundamental building blocks are made open source. So everyone can use that, and then you can come up with your solutions over it. So it benefits everyone because even an individual can use those building blocks and come up with something. One very, very classic example is, let's say, scikit-learn. Scikit-learn is a machine learning library which is open source. Yeah, so it is basically fundamental building blocks, and I as an individual, forget about using something as an organization, but I as an individual can just download that library, which is free of cost, which is open source, and I can start working on my machine learning projects. Similarly, you find something called TensorFlow. So TensorFlow is a deep learning library from Google, which is licensed under Apache. So again, the library is licensed under Apache, it is open source, and you can build on top of it. So as an organization, it is not just that you're looking at some particular advantage, but going the open source way brings benefit for everybody. Yeah, but at the same time, we have to have a balance. I mean, it's nice that the licenses are granting patent license also, so that it makes it very clear. But at the same time, you cannot just make something open source, which ultimately results in loss of business for you. Yeah. So let's say, for example, you have a very nice product which your competitor does not have, and they are struggling. And the moment you make it open source, they not only get code, but also get license to your patents on that, and they make their product as good as yours. So it's the question of business, it's the question of strategy, that what exactly you are trying to achieve by making something open source or contributing to open source. Yeah. Same way, when it comes to we using open source, it's again the same way. I mean, you want to comply with the obligations. We do not want to violate any open source at any point, and we are very strict with it. So if the license obligations are acceptable, we use it and comply. And while contributing, again, you have to balance your interest in terms of what it is going to achieve, what patents you are licensing, what patents you are holding back, how many patents you are licensing, what will be the implications of it, and so on. So does it answer your question, or at least partially does it answer your question?
So yes, sir, definitely. So I wanted to also understand, like, suppose if it's a patent portfolio, a family of patents, basically. I mean, does it also have any hindrances? Typically, if you can explain it with the industry experience, like for example, when it comes to IP valuation, do you actually make valuation from patent 1, 2, 3, 4, like that kind of thing, or is it like as a patent family that you actually look at it in the long term? Because cash flow analysis has to be done accordingly, right?
Right. So I mean, look, eventually it depends on a particular use case. Yeah, so there are technology domains where you might be more inclined to look at the portfolio as such or the family of patents as such. And there might be technology domains which are very, very niche. Even one patent or two patents can make a difference there for us, right? So it depends on what technology domain, where do we stand in that technology domain, what are competitors doing, what are others doing, and so on. So that's more of a topic which I would say is more concerning the patent valuation side. But yes, it is always very, very case specific.
Great, wonderful, sir.
Good morning, Ankur Sir. Am I audible?
Good morning. Yeah, audible.
Good to see you, sir, and again revisiting the open source concepts. I think all four of us share the same feeling.
Great to interact with you guys again. Yeah.
Sir, can you suggest some material so that people can read about open source?
I would say the description is start from Software Foundation website. Go to you can start Linux Foundation. Start giving you some information.
Sir, there's some
to achieve
disturbance in your voice, sir. If you can,
okay.
you can stop presenting most of the time.
Now or better or still
Still, there is some issue.
okay.
So there's
No.
now it's better. So now I think it's better. Then
Yeah, so this sources that some point something is objective of open source. Start source website, free software foundation. Maybe I have a list of some common sources, and so you can probably circulate. Yeah.
yes, sir.
Okay. So it was whatever, and it at least gives you a starting point to learn more.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Great. So any other questions?
So there are no more questions in the chat,
Okay.
and it's about time.
Good morning, sir. If I may ask a question.
Yes, Chetan.
So my question is, let's say I'm developing an application, and in that particular application, I'm using a library which has two conflicting licenses.
Okay.
So in such a situation, that conflicting license will create an issue for our application, or what's the situation there?
If you have conflicting, we will end up violating one license out of the two. And would it's like you are on your product being distributed. There might be ways to deal with the conflict if it is like copyleft, then way we are using, the way we are integrating, or by the software architecture it can be with. But if there's no possibility to do anything and they are, then it's better to move on. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. And it's good to see you.
Sir, I have a question. Can I, sir?
Yes, go ahead.
Sir, as we know that this field of licensing it is mainly, it consists of computer science experts who are lawyers as well. Like it requires knowledge of computers also. So what is your opinion, sir, being a non-computer science major? How can we collaborate in this?
Yeah, so I think I need a certain license such where you have to have some understanding of how software components talk to each other. Let's say how components are integrated or how they interact together. But you do not really need a very detailed thorough knowledge about it. So I do not really see a reason why someone who has any technical background cannot really learn it or grasp that. So you're not really going to code. I mean, for coding also you don't really need a prior degree to just have a bit of understanding. I'm not saying you can become, you can just thing without having a background. But for this purpose, the kind of understanding you need to get without really thinking about it. You yeah.
Thank you, sir.
You can you a lot of when you start googling around things. I think you should be able to gradually kind of.
Yes, sir. Sir,
Okay.
so now we don't see any more questions. So I request Yash to give the vote of thanks.
Yes, you are.
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much, guys. Thank you so much for inviting and much for your time. And we'll be interacting in future. Maybe someday we'll have a yeah.
Yes, sir. Sure.
Okay, so I think then I wish you all the best and hope you can